Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the Crisis Mappers webcast series. We're delighted to have Sanjana Hatatua from ICT for Peace describe sort of his efforts and going beyond crisis mapping. And I'd also really like to thank Curtis and Adil from GeoTime Oculus, who are hosting this webcast series for us. And if anyone has any questions as we progress through the presentation, please just type it in the chat, and I'll be facilitating the Q&A session after the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Adil to tell us just a couple minutes about GeoTime, and then we'll turn over to Sanjana. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
All right, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. A couple minutes before we start with Sanjana's presentation, I'd just like to talk a little bit about GeoTime and some of the work that we do. Essentially, what GeoTime works with, or works on, is solving visual problems. Right now, as many of you know, we're living in a world where we're constantly bombarded with lots of data. And unfortunately, a lot of this data is in unfamiliar formats, and it presents itself unintuitively. So what GeoTime does is it currently enhances the current visualizations we have for these data types. So if you look at the screen right now, on the extreme left-hand side, we generally have a popular visualization we see on the web right now, which really combines a time and space in one graphic, but it does it in two disparate views. You know, the temporal aspect near the top and the spatial aspect are kind of separate, and it induces a cognitive burden when we're trying to correlate time and space together. We have to kind of hold both images in our mind at once. Then we have the middle visualization, which is really what a lot of GIS experts are looking at right now, is a 2D overhead view. Unfortunately, what this 2D overhead view omits is really the temporal view of our data. We don't really get a chance to see, what the sequence of events are. We don't see, what happened first, or if two data points are happening at the same place at the same time, or are those two data points happening at different points in time. Then on the extreme right, what we have here is a linked node diagram, but and you can see these things can get quite complicated. But one of the things we can't see inside most linked node diagrams is, again, the temporal aspect. We see Jim and Bob are related, but we can't tell if their phone conversations happened in 2008 or in 2011 when we really need to when it's really relevant to our case. So what GeoTime does is it combines all three of these views inside a temporal view. So we have our geographic view at the bottom. We have time, which is measured vertically. So the most recent event in time happens lower, and the oldest event in time happens higher. And each one of these dots is really a GPS or an event that we're recording in space and time. And as we play back these events through time, we actually start seeing a sequence of events folding. And what we also end up seeing is how these events are related to each other through the lines that connect them. And as we map them, we can actually correlate time and space in one unique view. So what this really allows us to do is allows us to discover hidden intelligence inside our data and track communication patterns between people that we're interested in observing. So, for example, we use this, to analyze the Ushahidi data set. When we saw communication patterns inside the first emergency response data, we could see, things like within the first 12 hours, one of the most popular things that people were requesting was where their loved ones were, and then we saw sequentially people requesting, for food and water and reporting collapsed buildings and danger zones and whatnot. So we do that sort of analysis using this sort of framework. So here's some of the things that we're really good at. These are all the things we support. The highlighted figures here, such as GPS tracking or publishing visual reports, are things that a lot of people in the field right now are really requesting and that we handle. So again, we handle multiple data formats, your standard ArcGIS, Excel, and even GeoRSS, and we can output in multiple formats such as, Google Earth or Arc Explorer, and also we can publish reports, so we can capture the intelligence from our visual analysis in things like PDF or Microsoft Word. And what this allows us to do is context. So we can see is, the evolution of patterns over time. So for example, here's an oil spill. We actually see a definitive S shape formed. And what that means to a lot of, especially oceanographers and marine analysts, is it tells us that the oil spill is moving with the tidal flows. And we can't really see that in a 2D overhead view. We lose that. And again, we can also see communication patterns between GPS cabs and their movement patterns. And we can also do static data over time. So for example, we all remember Google flu data. Well, this is what it looks like over, an idea of what it would look like over time. The larger dots are larger incident reports and whatnot. We can see it change over time. And what it allows us to do is to actually watch the spread of the flu across the continental United States. So that's a little bit more about GeoTime. You can always email us if you have any more questions. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over the controls back to Sanjana so we can continue with the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thanks very much. And thank you to Crisis Mappers, Jen and Patrick in particular. It's a great honor to be speaking to you. I see some people on the list who I've actually communicated with over the years, and some other new folks. And it's quite late in the night in Sri Lanka, and I hope that wherever you are, you're quite comfortable and it's a better time of day. And I guess we have about 20 minutes and then 20 minutes for Q&A. So what I thought I'll do is also, because it's such a diverse audience, and I really don't know where you're from, what your interests are, to give a basic overview about what I do at the end of the day, and then leave you with some thoughts that maybe we can base our questions and questions on. I know that Jen, for those of you who are subscribed to the Crisis Mappers group, had sent out an email saying that I would touch on what the latest is of ICT for Peace was. I don't know whether I'll touch on the cutting edge. I certainly can speak to that, but what I thought I'll do is just basically give an overview of the kind of work that I do, have done over say 10 years, using technologies to support the peace process in my country, which has gone till 2 years ago through a black conflict and outright war. So that's why I say it's beyond crisis mapping, also just, for fun at crisis mapping, and not to stress that you shouldn't take it seriously, but to say that in the first instance, there are some great overlaps between ICT for Peace and crisis mapping. And as my last slide at the end of the presentation might suggest, that this is definitely an area we need to think about more robustly as well. And certainly I am interested in thinking about mostly based on my work in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. So for the few of you who might not know, I'm from Sri Lanka, which is a very small country. It's 21 million in South Asia. It's of India. And for all my life, I have, till 2 years ago, lived in a country that has been at war. I haven't, of course, experienced outright war. I haven't been on the front lines, but I think in a country this small and with a population this small as well, you simply cannot escape the shared societal and political impact of violent conflict. On May 19, 2009, the war came to an end quite decisively. The government forces, the army, decimated the Liberation of Tamil Tigers Elam, the LTTE, which was the terrorist group that they were fighting against. I won't go into the politics of it, which would require some time as well, but for 2 years we have been without war. But as this slide demonstrates or suggests, there is still systemic conflict, there's still systemic violence even after the end of war. So Sri Lanka is not post-conflict, it is post-war, but there is still significant violence in how the societal and political structures operate. Dissent is still not tolerated too much. Just a few weeks ago, we had a very prominent online web service, news service, that was razed to the ground, burnt to the ground. just, I think, a couple of days after there was reports that the president was somewhat dissatisfied with the news item that appeared on it. Of course, there is no causal linkage to any of the murders, abductions, extrajudicial killings, human rights violations, particularly under this regime with members in the regime. But there is a culture of impunity. There is a total breakdown in the rule of law, and that there is, and quite tragically, even after the war ended, quite a large democratic deficit. There is really no reconciliation to speak of in this country. It's absolute farce. There is nothing like what happened after post-apartheid South Africa. There's no real Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's really no interest even in truth-seeking robustly and in a meaningful manner. And so to cut a long story short, one can expect this, I suppose, after 3 decades of war. There is still a great deal of distrust between the communities and ethnic groups. There's a hell of a lot of militarization still, particularly in the north and the east of the country where the war raged, but in other parts of the country as well. Everything that we say or do or speak or congregate or suggest is taken or perceived with a national security mindset. So you're either with the state or you're either with the government or you're against it. So it's a very black and white kind of scenario. The government's democratic credentials are very largely suspect. Post-war, the emphasis has been on development, not really on democracy, and still poor rule of law. And the problem is, though, that everything I speak of, you wouldn't come to Sri Lanka today as a tourist. We have been ranked number 1 in National Geographic and New York Times. And it's a very beautiful country. It's the country that I love extremely deeply. This is home, and I would love to live nowhere else, even at the worst of times. But as a tourist or as an infrequent visitor, you would not really come to grasp the complex systemic violence that is still there in the country, even after war, because what you would be confronted by would be its beauty. But this is the kind of reality that I live in and try to address. So my work, pretty much after I finished university in Delhi and came back to Sri Lanka, I started thinking about the possible impact of ICTs on society, polity, and at the time how it might actually impact on the way we conduct a peaceful process. 10 years ago, nearly 10 years ago, nobody was thinking about this, and so I happened to be one of the first voices in the country and indeed in the region who suggested that technology could be applied for peace negotiations and peace processes in a robust manner, not just as in the periphery, but center and forward. And so, to cut a long story short, again, it so happened that there was a process called the One Text process, which is a negotiations mechanism, a way of conducting negotiations. You can Google it and find out what the exact nature of it is. Is essentially you get the conflicting parties to come agree on a single text over a period of time that can then be the basis of either a ceasefire agreement or a peace agreement. And so while this has been done in the real world, what we did in Sri Lanka was to map the process out entirely virtually on a commercial off-the-shelf software called Groove, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. This was at the time when Rayosi was not part of Microsoft and Groove was not part of Microsoft, so it was Groove in an independent capacity. And we used the program from, I think, version 2, then up to 2.5, and then actually our feedback helped, I think, then develop it into version 3, which is where we left it. But we designed the process through which the negotiations could be carried out entirely virtually. And this had never been done before. And there's a video up on it on my thing, which you can see. It looks quite fairly rudimentary, but its ability was that you got people from the diaspora and people who never be able to meet in public or be seen to be meeting in public, coming together in a virtual space, talking about real issues related to deeply emotional, contested, conflictual issues related to peace process. And you also had old politicians using their younger party members to kind of get the information off the virtual platform to them in a printed manner, which they kind of wrote on the margins, and that was then fed back into the system, both typed in but also scanned. So it was a really fascinating way in which you use technology to complement a peace process. And as I said, it's never been done. I think there's still some interest in replicating this. As an interesting aside, Patrick Mayan and I were in Stanford University just, I think, 2 weeks ago, and people like Larry Diamond and Clay Shirky were at this meeting talking about what would happen post-revolution, say, in Tunisia and Egypt. And it occurred to me that this is what we've been doing 8 years ago, where an entirely virtual negotiations process was something that we did. And may I also add, we failed, but our failure was fairly instructive. And it seemed to me that it might also be of interest to people like Larry Diamond and Clay, who now seem to be interested in this thing and in a wider context as well. I think at about the time Ushahidi started in Kenya, which was 2007, just a year after that, I started to use maps, Google Maps, for monitoring election violence. There's been a fair bit of it in Sri Lanka, much like Kenya and I suppose many other countries that are facing a democratic deficit. And I pretty much used it with an organization called the Center for Monitoring Election Violence, which is a spin-off of the organization I'm associated with in Sri Lanka, the Center for Policy Alternatives. And we've used it for, we do election monitoring. We are a registered election monitoring agency, and we have trained monitors around the country. And the maps, really, what's been interesting is that a lot of journalists who've been covering this for years on end have come to the maps and then seen anew the kind of violence and how it spreads both in the lead up to the election day and on election day itself. And they've been able to create stories out of this that would not otherwise have been written, like, for example, why in certain areas there are more instances of violence related or linked to a certain political party as opposed to other areas. And so the visualization on a map of what actually is quite common in Sri Lanka has really not necessarily held politicians more accountable, but it's a historical record of what actually happened on the ground for citizens or voters to use as they see fit, either on election day or to hold their political representatives accountable after they are voted into office. So this really has to the game for the way media covers election violence in the country. I've been fairly involved in the design of human rights violations monitoring platforms. This is a very, very early version of something that we did in around 2007. This was for a coalition of human rights organizations in Sri Lanka who felt that they needed to stop working against each other and start working with each other to form a coalition to monitor human rights and also advocate for strengthening human rights in the country. And this is a web-based version. It was the first kind of platform that they had on the web decided to collaborate on. This has now been further developed. I don't have a screenshot of it, but we are, through another organization I helped set up called InfoShare, in the process of developing this into an enterprise-level architecture that runs on the web. It's completely secure, geared for Sri Lankan human rights organizations, geared for austere conditions, hostile conditions, violent conditions, and this is the design of which something, the evolution of which something I'm both have been involved in, but also an aspect of which I have an enduring interest in, and its applicability, as many of you on this conference call will recognize, is actually more than outside. It's wider than Sri Lanka as well. Something else that I do is kind of use technology to monitor what is reported in the mainstream media. This has been something that the center itself has been doing long before I joined from the late 90s. But what I brought is a dedicated blog and for our monitoring side of things, also more streamlined use of technology so that we really capture some of the, for example, the hate speech, the memes, the words, particularly in the vernacular that people use, say, during election campaign period or when talking about a particular issue or place or person or political party or issue or process, so that there is record about how mainstream media either helps augment and strengthen peace or how it actually contributes to violence. And this is something that, quite frankly, nobody else is doing in the country to the extent that we have. And our focus is on the vernacular, but we've done a fair bit in English as well. Another thing is actually I'm really interested in working outside of English and outside of Colombo in rural areas where I think peace is most needed and where the technology is at its most rudimentary. Something that I did about 2 years ago is go into a very, very remote village in actually close to nowhere, and this was a village that was largely what's called female-headed households, largely because the sons or the husbands or the brothers have gone to war and haven't returned. So it's the females who are actually heading the households in this. It was a group of 76 villagers, and what we did was very simple. At the end of the day, we just transformed a terrestrial community radio model onto an internet radio model. Community radio in Sri Lanka is really problematic because you don't get licenses. But they really wanted to have a way in which the community could discuss issues that were important to them, ranging from gender-based violence to domestic violence to just issues of police corruption and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So basically issues that the mainstream media wasn't really interested in covering for these this group of 76 villagers. So we created a way in which they could broadcast over the internet and onto their mobile devices. And this was something that I did a blog post on, and it's become hugely read for the model that we created over the space of 5 days that was entrenched into the way that those 76 villagers work. But through the blog post, I've learned since then that is applicable again to a much larger context outside of Sri Lanka as well, in communities that might have problems with terrestrial radio broadcasting and want to do the same with the internet. But really my central focus since about 2006 has been on citizen journalism, and through a website called Ground Views. Some of you may have heard of it, some of you may have read the content on it. How do I put it? It's I guess it's pretty much the one site that during the height of war, though I never realized it would be it's such a historical chapter, during the height of it, at its end and after it, has been a site that has captured stories and produced stories and published articles and content, photos and video that quite simply hasn't gone anywhere else. And we've really tried to change the media agenda in the country, and also tried to, by example, demonstrate how technology can actually assist, not just in post-conflict reporting, but also reporting issues of human rights and corruption and accountability and war crimes, etc., during war in a manner that is principled and at the end of the day keeps everybody concerned alive, which is also a great concern. So this is something that I've been involved in since 2006, and quite frankly, this is something I'm involved in daily for the past 4 or 5 years. So right now there are about 6 million words. I've read about 5.75 million of these 6 million words. Till I got a co-editor to the site in October last year, Nigel Nugawala. I was the sole creator, curator, editor, marketer of the site. So site is set up in a way that nothing goes up without moderation. So I've basically read around over 5.5 million words of content, commentary, articles that hasn't gone anywhere else in the media landscape in Sri Lanka. There was an astounding response to a special edition that we invited authors to contribute to on May 19th last year, 1 year after the end of war, and that went on to become a book because the response was so good, was so incredible that many people wanted it in the form of a book. Hundreds of thousands came onto the website. As I said earlier, we've covered stories nobody else has touched. I have a background in English literature, so I'm really interested in how different forms of literature online can also explore issues so that mainstream media can't and prose can't. So we've also explored satire, poetry. We were the first to launch a civil society YouTube channel. We were the first to use social media, social networking like Twitter and Facebook, and leveraging that for bearing witness on human rights violations, etc. And I've been fairly interested in using free online platforms like Google Maps and Google Moderator. Right now there's an ongoing discussion on what democracy means in Sri Lanka using Google Moderator, and nobody else in the country seems to be doing this kind of thing. And initiative of mine launched in January this year was to introduce something called long-form journalism. So the articles that you would find, say, in the New Yorker or on the New York Times Magazine, basically to develop a culture of essay writing in this country to deal with some of the issues that we are facing as a nation, both post-war and in terms of democracy, emergent democracy as well. So this is kind of stuff that I've done with Ground Views, and we also created, when we first launched, the first kind of like a code, a framework for civil discourse online. There's no other website that has this kind of thing. What I thought was that there's plenty of spaces for hate speech and for bitter invective. What I wanted was a platform for progressive civil discussion And I created this basic framework for civil discourse, and it's kind of framed the discussions on the site ever since, which is why many people come to the site, because you can actually have a disagreement and agree to disagree and not end up insulting each other in expletives. So there is a quality of debate on the site that you can't really find anywhere else on the web in the country. What I'm really interested in is not the telegenics of what I call the revolutions in the Middle East, all well and good, and I fully and wholeheartedly endorse it. Must be done, has to be done, somebody has to do it, and it's a great, positive, optimistic thing. But what I've been really challenged by is living in a country just as bad, with no hope of a revolution akin to that which we saw in Tunisia and Egypt, and what I call bearing witness. So it's for posterity that I do a lot of these things. I'm interested in how curation, participation models online, collaboration online can actually help bear witness, not with a view to regime change, but just as much as you can bear witness to what is happening around you. I've always been interested as pretty much when I started itself, in this part of the world, it was pretty obvious that people were using mobile phones, so to how to use them and leverage them for citizen journalism and what has now been, what is now termed crowdsourcing. It wasn't at a time even a word when I started, but how you could actually use forms, etc., to bear witness. And as I said, using technologies and various ways of literature as well online to capture narratives that would not otherwise have been ever produced by people who are at risk and who are actually, some of the contributors to Ground Views are now being killed as well. So some of the content on the site is the last stuff that they were engaged with before they were assassinated. And I believe that change is rare. Tunisia and Egypt and the stuff that's happening in the Middle East is rare. But what I have tried to contribute to using technology and ICT is maybe a richer history, a fuller history than what would have otherwise been written by the victors alone. I've been involved for a number of years in training human rights organizations. This has been under the radar. I don't like to talk about it too much for obvious reasons, but this has involved training on almost every imaginable aspect of online communications and mobile communications for 2 or 3 years for the frontline rights defenders in the country and organizations. It's work that is hugely fulfilling and rewarding. Can't talk too much about it, but earlier this year we came out with a poster that was anchored to local realities, but since I've been told it's resonant with many other contexts as well. A poster that could be put up in organizations that reminded people at risk what basic measures they needed to take to be safe as much as possible, to the extent possible online. And the design, the content of this was done based on the work that I had done over the past couple of years with people who were at the front line of violence for advocating human rights. I am very concerned by, and I am also very deeply, as a consequence, interested in archiving content online. I think that's a problem I think everybody on this conference call would have faced or would face. At its simplest level, it's just losing data. Say you don't take a backup and you lose data, but that's personal data, which might be very valuable to you. You multiply that, if you can, by, say, a population or ethnic group, and then you imagine what would happen if data that they entrusted to a platform on the web, what would happen to them if it was lost. I mean, it has very, very, very serious consequences and very grave consequences. Something that I did a couple of years ago is to just buy up space on Boxnet and put up a WordPress blog and started to basically rip websites off and archive them as zip files and put them up. And I never knew that what I would be doing almost in my free time would now become the only archives that exist online on the web of websites that were critical during Sri Lanka's peace process but are no longer online. So they've completely been erased. And these archives are absolute, complete historical records of a peace process that failed. But I didn't realize at the time that they would be the only archive, that it would have been absolutely tragical had I not done what I did at the time. And so this is also something that I continue to do to the best of my ability as time permits. But to archive this information that is produced now increasingly by, say, for example, the crisis mappers, I think is something that we all need to look at more robustly. So a couple of years ago, to come full circle, I started talking and writing about ICT for Peace. It was an acronym that I coined up, and then later found that the ICT for Peace Foundation, led by Daniel Stauffacher, which some of you may know, coming out of the World Summit on Information Society, also started to use. But I didn't know about that initiative till when I started using and started the WordPress blog around 2006. And if you go to it, you'll find that I have written an inordinate amount of content on almost every imaginable aspect dealing with peace building, human rights, democracy, crises, disasters, and the applicability of information communications technology. And this is something. This is my passion. This is what I do. And much of my writing is in the public domain for anybody to use as they see fit. And this blog is something that I've been maintaining for since 2006 for a number of years. So I came into the field of crisis information management, I suppose, what's come to be called crisis information management, through my experience of the Boxing Day tsunami. Everybody has a personal story. I have mine in 2004. And what I did was to very quickly transform a peace network that was on the ground into a disaster relief network. The network used Groove. There were very interesting ways in which the network worked, and it didn't. That collaboration occurred, and it didn't. At the time, this was, by the way, pre-Sahana. Sahana wasn't the platform at the time. It was very instructive when I came out with a paper that I think people still read, because it really prefigures much of what to this day is being written on lessons learned from the applicability and use of technology in responding to crises and disasters. And coming out of that, at around the time the Microsoft Humanitarian Systems Group was being set up by the greats in this industry like Robert Kirkpatrick, Nigel Snowd, Eric Rasmussen, and the real the giants in this field. With my humble experience, I proposed 10 points that, when I read back today, are still resonant with the context out there, post-Haiti, post-Pakistan, post-Kyrgyzstan, post-Gulf oil spill, and certainly post-Middle East now. So this is stuff that written years ago, but out of personal experience, that seems to be very resonant even today. And so that brings me to the ICT for Peace Foundation, which I've been very happily associated with since 2006, when Daniel invited me to join it. And I suppose I do a lot of work for it, but I suppose pertinent for this discussion is something that I do call Crisis Information Wikis. Some of you have gone to some of these that were created over the course of last year. Right now, at the invitation of Patrick Meyer, actually last week when I was attending TED in Long Beach, California, I created a wiki on Libya that I currently curate. But this is something that I do on behalf of the foundation whenever there is a crisis. And whenever I have the time, frankly, I create a crisis information wiki. And basically, these wikis do, in general, I mean, each one has unique features and unique information sources, but in general, overarchingly, they're kind of a comprehensive, curated list of crisis information sources and crisis information and ways to help, importantly. What I do is I collate, over, let's say, 150, 200 sources, and then put them onto a wiki that I keep updating them daily as possible, which includes OJA sit reps, the relief web briefing kits, which are superb, but few people have the time or patience to download it themselves, so that I do every 2 days, 3 days, put it up on the wiki. ETC sit reps from WFP, for example, some of which don't make it onto the public web in a timely manner. I had access to it, and I put them up. Background documents, as much as I could find. Importantly, social media, so Twitter feeds, Facebook groups, Flickr photos, any other content that I can find on social networking sites. As many mapping resources as I can find from Google, the UN, UNOSAT, elsewhere, ESRI, etc. And for example, in Chile and now in Libya, what I've done is I've leveraged Google Translate to kind of translate into English content that was respectively in Spanish or Arabic. And what I've also done in the past is kind of when the UN puts out some document in the latest Microsoft Office format, which everybody can open, what I've done is I've taken that, converted it into a Google Docs, and then put up that content line on the wiki so that anybody anywhere on any platform can access it very easily. I'm fairly interested in curating these wikis. They've come into praise by a number of people. It's, for me, fairly easy to do, and it's my little contribution to actually the more giant services that Crisis Mappers and people like Jen and Patrick are doing on a much larger scale. I'd like to end with some challenges. I mean, these are This is actually a slide that extrapolates from the tweets that I did during the excellent crisis mapping conference over 2 days in Boston last year, when I was a very happy participant on behalf of the ICT for Peace Foundation. So I'm really interested in how information visualization and all of what I've done can actually contribute to democracy. I'm a skeptic. I don't think I've made any bloody difference at all in Sri Lanka, because the war's end was without witness. And I don't contribute to strengthen democracy. Having said that, I think there is something to be said about capturing these narratives for posterity. You can't ignore them. They are captured. You can't erase them. And even if you kill the people behind the initiative, the information lives on. So I'm interested in that process. I don't think there's any easy causal linkage between information visualization and putting these things up on the web and a stronger democracy, but I'm damn interested in what that link is. I wonder whether the stuff that I do is not sexy, in that I think it's always when the Middle East goes up in flames, or when there's something like Tunisia and Egypt, that it captures everybody's attention. And I think there's a lot that technology does behind the scenes for peace processes, which are actually a much longer process, that are equally important, but I don't often get asked for sound bites, etc. Maybe that's a good thing as well, but I'm really interested in how technologies can help post-revolution and over the period of, say, a number of years, helping strengthen democracy. I'm a bit concerned that open standards are still lacking. Like, there are a lot of platforms and systems that are in and of themselves fantastic, but I wonder whether they are the information and the users in them are locked in, and whether it's more beneficial and useful to think about a way in which collaboration also means that you can port information from one platform to the other with as little as fast as possible. I often find that in much of what is written and said and spoken and presented and submitted on crisis mapping and crowdsourcing, that context is missing. The qualitative nature of the content and analysis of that is missing. Who the creator was, where, gender, etc., gender in particular, that kind of discussion is missing. And who, when, where, how people consume this information is also missing. And I think that this has deep implications coming from conflict transformation, peace-building dynamics and theory about how crisis information is both produced and received. And I think that bears some robust discussion and debate and interrogation. And I also wonder whether what is an absolutely wonderful initiative, actually, of a global volunteer base supporting crisis mapping is sustainable over the long term, and particularly with regards to ethno-political conflict, what problems and challenges there might be in getting a global volunteer base address what might be local, deeply cultural specific issues. I think there are lessons from Pakistan. I don't think anybody was interested to the nature that and degree that they were interested in Haiti. I think we need to look at that. I think some disasters are, as I say, sexier than others. And as I say, my own country, I mean, the war occurred without any witness, and it ended without any witness. I'm deeply saddened by it. But I think that technology can actually retrospectively look back and then see what actually happened, and can bear witness to a process, as opposed to this, I find, fetish on crisis mapping, which is often event-based. And I think the two are fundamentally different. I think that people are still scared to share their failures. This is a point I made at the Crisis Mapping Conference as well. I think everybody, when they speaks about how good they did something or how successful an initiative was. But I think everybody knows that it wasn't as successful or as good as people make it out to be. And I think that failures are hugely instructive. We need not be ashamed of it. And I think, like Catherine Burklass and Mobile Active and what they did last year, it would be really beneficial if people started sharing their failures so that we could all learn from them and not repeat the same failures as well. My daily reality is PTSD, fear, anxiety, censorship, and real systemic conflict that is really hard to explain, but that's my life. That's why I love this country. That's why I'll never leave, but that's also why it's very challenging. And so I suppose my abiding interest is in how ICTs can help in all of these aspects. There is no panacea, there's no perfect solution, but all of what I've done over a number of years has been to experiment, champion, interrogate, explore ways in which ICTs in their full range and spectrum can help democracy strengthening, human rights strengthening, and at the end of the day, the quality of life that I suppose many of you in the West would take for granted. That is my dream. I hope that someday it will come about in Sri Lanka. And basically, that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much. And I think we go with questions now. I must confess that while I've been speaking, I haven't looked at the comments that you've been sending in. So Jen, are you going to like throw some at me, or do you want me to scroll through and then answer any stuff that's come up?
Well, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Everybody has been virtually clapping in the side window, and especially, I don't know if you can page back to that last slide that you had. There's people that have been saying that just that slide alone could be a basis for a whole conference. I mean, we could divide up into groups just based on these really, really important questions. So I think that I really appreciate your presentation, and it's been feeding so many different ideas and food for thought along the way that it's difficult to know where to start. But I was wondering about this question personally. I was wondering about the success stories issue and the failing forward, and how how one can I guess increase incentives to be honest and to say where these efforts have failed or where they have maybe not met their potential. Especially in a world where, in part, we're trying to win converters, that at least, okay, there's a possibility. This is, for some people, a very new field. So at the same time, you're trying to show that there is hope and that there's a lot of positive in it. But I completely agree with you that we've been we need to sort of increase incentives just to be honest with one another. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, as you said, there can be a session or in the conference itself. I think what's important is to get the donors in. I think the donors have a huge role to play because they should stop holding. Let me put it this way: I think there is a tendency to not be honest in front of donors because you want to say how successful you've been with the money that you've received, and so that I think that creates a culture of dishonesty at the end of the day. Which is unfortunate because I think if donors also realize that it's honesty that you want, failing forward can be an incredibly useful way of learning how to best spend their money as well. So I think one of the things that Catherine did with the mobile active thing was to get the World Bank involved. And the World Bank was very supportive. So I suppose one model is to actually get donors involved, have it under, say, Chatham House rule where it is non-attribution, and create a safe space so that you aren't judged for the reason you failed, but you are listened to why you failed. I think it's easy to judge, but I think we tend to forget that we all fail sometimes. I'm very open with my failure. But I think that if you create the safe space for the sharing, so that you take off the competition, you take off the donor agendas, you take off the personal parochial agendas, I think it's difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think that all of us in this field can benefit from it.
So, for example, in the Crisis Mapping Conference, we could, speak with the donors in advance and say we think there's so much to be learned from the mistakes and the missteps, and so we want to have a failing forward panel, and this is gonna be a safe space for this kind of sharing, and maybe even if they can listen to it, just loop them in and say this is Chatham House rules and.
Absolutely, and all you need are some champions who are. I mean, not everybody will be comfortable. We have to give that. But as you say, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think even if people just listen, I think could actually plant the seeds in some of these people who are sensitive to the instructive lessons of failing. That they don't needlessly have to do that same thing again. So I think there is some merit in organizing a session like that. Certainly.
For sure. I'm going to go through some of these questions now. I have one from Sentil, who's saying that quality assurance is a key component of crisis mapping, and then asks, how have you tackled that area from, quote, ground view perspective?
Yeah, in two ways. One is any citizen journalism initiative, I think, is turning the mainstream media model on its head in that the journalist is no longer considered to be the expert. It is actually the crowd or the readers or the consumers who where the knowledge is supposed to reside in. And the way this works in Sri Lanka is that nothing what I put on ground news I've said is the honest to God truth and straight from the Bible or the Quran or whatever. I put it up as a perspective, as one perspective, and I've always encouraged even governments to contribute to it. One major story that I broke 2 years ago in August was a series of 7 images from an IDP camp that was inhabited by about 400,000, upwards of 400,000 Tamil civilians, plus suspected LTT card at the time, in absolutely horrendous, hellish, and I mean that quite literally, hellish conditions. And everybody in all public officials or government officials assuring us that everything was fine and that they were being taken care of. There was one day where there was a flash flood and there was the horrendous conditions where I think captured the mobile phone. And late at night when I was sitting and just getting ready to sleep, I got these images and I had to make a judgment call, publish them and face significant risk to the site and myself and others, or to ignore them. And I did publish them, but I published them saying that if anybody can prove that these were photoshopped or that these were in any way false, that the public retraction would be immediate and as public as the original article. Of course, it wasn't. It was picked up by Al Jazeera, New York Times, and the BBC, and it became a fairly big story. But all the stories, all the content, all the photos and videos we publish on Ground News, it has now become, in a sense, a trusted platform. So you might not necessarily agree with the content that's up there, but you would not debate its quality. And the model is that if you do have something that runs completely counter and gives a different perspective, that the site is very, very open to it. I have never not once censored that kind of content or comments simply because I haven't got any. So it's the public discussion debate that, in a sense, is the site's best quality assurance, because if I put something that's a falsification or a outright lie, then it's very quickly responded to by the community. And some of my failures insofar as getting content out also have been instructive in this regard. For example, I tried to offer a flicked video camera to get content out of the IDP camps. That was an absolutely miserable failure. I mean, I didn't get any damn article out of the camps, and I was accused, I suppose, perhaps rightfully, I did it for the best of intent, but I was accused of trying to sensationalize the conditions of people in the IDP camps. And I learned from that. And so the community is a very vibrant community. They hold me accountable for the curation that I do, and that's its best quality assurance. And the fact that at the end of the day, I suppose that it's been recognized by organizations like the International Federation of Journalists, the IFJ, which is a worldwide body that last year came out with a report that said the site has covered issues that not a single other media in the country has, is, I suppose, some recognition of the quality of the content that you have on the site.
Wonderful, Sanjana. Marta is asking whether a global volunteer base combined with local nodes would help to create more context awareness.
Yes and no. I mean, definitely. I think it's a question that really requires a long answer, Martha, and you and I can talk about this later on. But for the benefit of the call conferencing, I think I'll let you just place one concern I have, and that is that I think Jen can also speak to this with her background in conflict resolution, peace building, and it is that when we're talking about complex ethnopolitical conflict, and particularly protracted ethnopolitical conflict, you have, even in the diaspora, even amongst those who might be in the volunteer base, entrenched ideology and entrenched histories, received memories and received histories that might affect the judgment call that you make on content and information that you get from the ground and that you place up on a map at its simplest in terms of a process. And so while, say, an act of God, say, a natural disaster is very simple, like something like Haiti is very simple because you're actually plotting needs of communities, not on an ethnic basis. That's pretty easy to do. I think there are flags that need to be raised when you use the same model for, say, mapping genocide or crimes of mass atrocity or long-term ethnopolitical conflict, because then you really need to take into account the nature of the volunteer base, who there are, and then perhaps make them undergo some training so that their own bias, as much as like we do for media monitoring in Sri Lanka, so that your bias is minimized to the extent possible. And what you're actually then doing is you're judging content based on metrics that are more robust and actually take you beyond your subjective interpretation of content. I think that's a huge challenge, also because of the transitory nature of a global volunteer base, because you spend time training a caucus and then they move on for whatever reason, and then you have to train the others. So I think it's a never-ending process. So I think there are challenges, but this is not in any way to suggest that a global volunteer base is unnecessary or unwarranted. I just think that for particular disaster, for particular types of conflict, that we need to look at it more robustly.
So there can actually be some strength to having outsiders, people that aren't actually from the location, as a part of some sort of media mapping effort, insofar as
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely, Jen. But also the flip side also, I mean, so it's a difficult thing to do. I mean, yes and no, because if you are from outside, you might also not, for example, pick up on language cues. A particular word might mean something in the context of how it was expressed or said to somebody who knew the local dynamics as opposed to an outsider. So the teams I've worked with are people from outside who've been not part of the conflict, working together with people kind of who know the conflict well as well. And I think that kind of combination really works, because the subjective bias of each group cancels each other out, and then if you can have a constructive discussion and sufficient training, I think that kind of team really can bring value to the curation and analysis of any conflict.
Thank you very much for bringing nuance to this discussion and a certain amount of depth, I think, because it's been an operating assumption, I think, that needs to be challenged in some way, or to at least see what peel back the picture a bit and see what's actually going on. So Heather wants to know, what are the next steps to building open source standards or open standards?
But I suppose that is a question best addressed to the champions in these fields, Sahana, Ushahidi, Instead, and I suppose Thomson Reuters and the likes of those organizations. I think each of them have compelling platforms, and I think the applicability of these platforms is not the question or the debate at the moment. I think everybody recognizes that they are of value. But I think that each of these platforms need to have discussions, and I think that some of these discussions have already occurred and are ongoing and are very positive, that they need to move from collaboration into ways in which the information in each of these platforms can be transferred easily between each other. So, for example, data collected, say, in Shahidi, translocated into a map that's hosted on Sahana, that is then analyzed through technology developed by Instead, and visualized through, say, technology that's developed by another group. So I think the collaboration of organizations is one thing, but the sharing of information between the platforms is another. One can lead to the other, but I think the emphasis has to be on both. Otherwise, what you do is, for the best of reasons, and each of these are incredibly powerful, compelling platforms, you end up with the worst of outcomes, which is that you lock in people into your particular platform. That might be a good thing in the short term, but I think that has problems over the long term.
And we have one last question, if you have time for it. Sentil is asking, what will be weighed more in terms of witness mapping for international advocacy? Will it be branded media sources or crisis mapping sources? And then goes on to say, is branding of sources an issue for witness mapping?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Well, I think they're asking you to weigh in on what has more value, branded media sources or crisis mapping sources. I don't know if by crisis mapping sources, Sentil means Twitter.
Oh, he means authenticity.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure myself, but authenticity.
Well, I mean, I can only speak from my personal experience, and it is that I treat all media with an equal dignity, but not all media with equal skepticism. I think that's something that Dan Gilmore, who's an American writer, often says, to treat everything that you read with a critical eye. This, at the end of the day, is Buddhist philosophy as well. And so what I do with the Crisis Information Wikis, for example, for the ICT for Peace Foundation, is every single information source, using 10 years demonstrating experience, I first open and try to get a sense of. So it's not just a list of media sources, but I try to also identify as best as possible the bias, whether they are, for example, with the crisis map, the wiki on Libya, whether they are, for example, pro-Gaddafi or not. At its very simplest. So you're trying to get a sense of Twitter accounts or Facebook groups that you don't know of to the best extent possible. Now, I don't possibly have an answer to this, but one answer I can give you, and you're right. I mean, I don't have any better answer. It is that I just have a sense, I can't put it any other way, after 10 years of being immersed in this, by looking at a media source, I get a sense of its veracity. And that gut sense is what I go with. I mean, there are models that you can do this as well. But in terms of a larger answer to your question, I think, quite frankly, that you can't distinguish between anymore. Best source of information I had, for example, out of that gave information on what was actually happening in the IDP camps just after the war in Sri Lanka, was a Twitter account that was recommended to me by a trusted source, but I didn't know the author of. And I took a judgment call, and I flagged that Twitter account, and at the end of the day, UNHCR also started following it because it was an incredible source of information, and it was just the one account operating out of the camp. So I wasn't telling everybody to follow it like the gospel, but it was a fundamentally important voice that fed into other discussions. And to this day, I don't know who it was. Now, that wasn't branded to any, but that became branded because that Twitter account became known for information that it produced. So I think the issue is a larger discussion, but I don't think today that mainstream media like the New York Times and even Al Jazeera has the monopoly of veracity and authenticity.
I agree with you, and it'd be great to sort of somehow find a way to aggregate all of the different expert knowledge that people in this community have, that sort of extra sense about, gut feeling about what might be a great source or not. And well, that's going to wrap it up for us. It's 1:00. I really, really appreciate you pushing this debate forward, and I really mean that. I think that the questions that you've asked, particularly in the last slide and in the Q&A, could, frame a whole set of new discussions going forward. So we really appreciate your time, Sanjana. It's been wonderful. We also want to thank, again, Curtis and Adil from GeoTime Oculus. And I'm Jen Simke from Crisis Mappers Network. Please join us next time for the next webcast. And everybody is saying thank you in the side window. So we appreciate it and hope to see you all again soon. Bye.
Thanks very much, and bye, and take care, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sanjana.